Previous feminist advances in academia and some areas of the culture have made it harder to discuss the fact that such things as masculine virtues indeed do exist. Of course, that doesn't mean women can't hold such virtues, but this also doesn't make these virtues any less masculine. By the same token, such things as feminine virtues indeed do exist as well, and of course, both masculine and feminine shortcomings or vices or failings also do exist. And the episode of Pandemic Hysteria has provided a quite decent spectacle of all of these. And if we draw the appropriate lessons, our activism and effectiveness can indeed improve. And those lessons need to be drawn quite fast, as the Hysteria episode is coming to an end, whilst leaving our friends in Australia and New Zealand trapped into the feminine toxicity of safetyism. Did I piss off everyone already? Let's explore. Hello everyone, my name is Lucian Valsan, and on behalf of the Freedom Alternative Network, I wish to thank the whole team at Justice for Men and Boys for making this possible, and of course for inviting me to this conference. However, I will say that I won't be doing this anymore. Next time, I want to speak to you all in person. And I'm not saying that just because I despise online events writ large and the hysterical reasons that force these things, but also because, well, it's unmasculine. And hopefully I'll be able to explain this both succinctly and clearly enough by the end of this video and avoid pissing off too many people. So, last year I spoke to you about narrative curves in general terms on my channel and in applied particular terms for non-feminist goals on this very virtual stage. Some of what I predicted last year has already started to happen, especially the slow changing of the elite. It still remains to be seen whether that will create the inflection point or not, but it does show that looking at things through a narrative curve is indeed helpful. For those who don't understand what I mean, I urge you to watch those two videos. It will, at the very least, provide a new perspective, even if you end up disagreeing with it. The thing is, the pandemic hysteria is also following a narrative curve, and this, of course, is unsurprising given the fact that the whole crisis is first and foremost political, just like the issue of men's rights, where facts, generally speaking, don't matter. If facts mattered, we wouldn't be making a virtual conference out of a fear of a virus with over 99.8% survival rate for starters. So, for the purposes of this talk, the presentation is divided as follows. 1. Definitions. 2. Short history. 3. Slow and painful end of the hysteria. 4. How to draw the lessons. And 5. Some conclusions. Alright, so definitions are always important, but also a source of conflict. In fact, for those intellectually rigorous, definitions are the source of conflict, because the way a concept is defined, or what people mean by a word, drives most of the rationale. This gets particularly nasty with controversial notions, whether those notions are intrinsically controversial or not. Nevertheless, I'll take that chance because it's a masculine virtue. So, the least controversial approach is to take evolution into account. If we regard academic gender studies as what it actually is, namely intellectual trash, we immediately understand that so-called gender roles did not emerge out of a decree from the Council of Wise Men in Patriarchistan, but rather emerged slowly as a consequence of partnership between individual men and women throughout our existence as a species. If we hold that to be true, and I do, then surely that comes with specific masculine and feminine archetypal virtues and shortcomings. So, a masculine or feminine virtue, or a shortcoming or a vice, is a trait found predominantly in one sex as a result of that sex's evolutionary past. For the purposes of this talk, we are concerned with safetyism, which I will dare to call a feminine vice. Women will, statistically, prioritize safety, or whatever is being sold in public propaganda as safety, over other aspects. This is oftentimes a virtue when managing a household, but it is distinctly a vice when managing societies. And the pandemic hysteria showed this very clearly to anyone with two brain cells to rub together. Ruth H. Bloch, Professor Emeritus of History at the UCLA, and a feminist, mind you, though admittedly a more honest one, which aren't being made anymore. She also made this distinction, showing that a virtue can become a vice, and that some virtues and vices are indeed feminine or masculine. In the paper The Gendered Meanings of Virtue in Revolutionary America, she put hypocritical do-goodism in the category of feminine vices. In the pandemic context, New Zealand is a prime example of that. Jacinda Ardern displays almost all feminine vices, and it's the kind of tyrant that C.S. Lewis warned everyone about when he said that the tyranny sincerely exercised for the good of its victims is indeed the most oppressive. As of September the 7th, New Zealanders aged 12 and above are legally required to keep a written record using a government-approved form on where exactly they have been when visiting certain places. The feminine-viced media says this is for the safety and contact tracing. I, however, will continue to insist that this makes the KGB inherently more democratic than the regime in New Zealand. In fact, we can seriously start to argue on whether the Stasi or the Romanian Securitate weren't indeed morally superior to Jacinda Ardern's safetyist regime. I mean, even the Stasi avoided such draconian control over 12-year-old children. On the side of masculine virtues, honor and courage are of relevance for this talk. In the case of courage, nobody will sincerely argue that women are statistically equally courageous to men. Risk-taking in particular, and courage in general, is indeed a masculine virtue. In the case of honor, however, while there is a broad consensus that it's a masculine trait, even feminists, whilst disparaging the very notion of honor, still agree that it's a masculine trait. I'm a bit less on board with the consensus. Why? Because of definitions. However, to avoid getting into a long discussion about honor, I will go with the friendliest definition of honor, namely to keep an obligation or an agreement. This definition is good enough for the purposes of this talk, even though it's not precise enough for my taste. But hey, there's a time limit for speeches here. In the case of honor, during the pandemic hysteria, it became self-evident that it's a masculine trait. No matter how idiotic the so-called measures were, those who imposed them ended up observing them distinctly on whether they were of a masculine ethos or of a feminine one. Scandals of breaking their own recommendations almost universally involve individuals of a feminine ethos. And I say individuals of a feminine ethos because, as I said, these classifications are archetypal and not necessarily or rigidly biological. So, you had Nancy Pelosi, Neil Ferguson, Erna Solberg, that would be the Norwegian Prime Minister, Gavin Newsom, Scottish MP Margaret Ferrier, you get the point. All of these individuals definitely did not manifest the masculine virtue of honor. On the other hand, you had individuals like Angela Merkel, Boris Johnson, Orban Viktor, Jair Bolsonaro, and indeed Donald Trump. You may like or despise these people, but all of them did display the masculine virtue of honor and kept their agreement and did not break their own rules, or lack thereof in the case of Bolsonaro. The point being that the crisis was managed mostly by individuals lacking the masculine virtue of honor, which of course ended up with an endless strain of hypocritical do-goodism, further erosion of public trust in the institutions, and general harm over civilization itself. Now, I also have to admit that I personally regard the erosion of public trust in institutions to be generally a good thing. Trusting the Wuhan Honk organization or the government to protect you from the Wuhan sneeze is a terrible choice. So, in a way, the lack of masculine virtues in most of our leaders will also yield some positive results. Anyway, another reason that I spend so much time on definitions is because the talk makes a lot more sense if we use the same reference point. Whether you agree with the reference point or not is a separate discussion in which I will argue that agreement is not necessary, but that's because I'm a propagandist by trade, and in the issue of this pandemic issue, truth, agreement, and consent of the governed has been suspended or sometimes entirely terminated. So commitment to truth and agreement when fighting such a lopsided leviathan is counterproductive. Anyway, Chapter 2, Short History. I was saying earlier that the pandemic hysteria followed its own narrative curve. To many people, this is still counterintuitive, and that's because, sadly, too many people still buy into the notion that the pandemic is about health, science, and facts. It's not. It never has been. It's about politics, power, money, and control. That's 99% of it. The rest may indeed be about health, science, and facts, and whatever. And because it's about politics and control, it follows the rules of other political pursuits. Therefore, it has a narrative curve. This talk is about gynocentrism and masculine virtues, so I'll focus only on that subtopic. This whole hysteria started with a plethora of gynocentric and indeed downright misandric assumptions. Remember when you were told to be more like women because women observe the so-called social distancing rules better? Not only that assertion was mostly false, indeed it was true only in Germany and some areas of the United States, but even if it were true, the very notion is gynocentric because it assumes that observing the disdainful nonsense of the rules is inherently good, and as it turns out, it wasn't. This hysterical episode of humanity also brought in a few paradoxes, like the fact that the most feminine country of Europe, Sweden, indeed had one of the most masculine responses in the developed world. And I insist with the developed world because I would like to remind everyone that the majority of the planet either did not bother with this cough to begin with, or stopped the hysteria more than a year ago. And I'm not talking here about the governments, but the people. For instance, this is footage from August the 20th, 2021 in Kiev, Ukraine that I took myself. Now I won't leave the sound on because I don't want to create copyright concerns for the organizers of this conference, but what I want to say is that technically speaking, this festival is illegal. However, the Ukrainian people threw politicians into the garbage disposal, literally, not figuratively, in June 2020, so the pandemic hysteria ended in Ukraine roughly around that same time. I've just spent almost the whole month of August and early September in Ukraine. I will say this: Ukraine would be an example of a country where the pandemic is indeed about science and facts. You only read about it on the website of the Ministry of Health and hear about it for about 10 to 15 seconds, maybe, in the evening newsreel, and that's it. In other words, the people have manifested the masculine virtue of courage and rejected safetyism. Also, at the beginning of this hysteria, you were told that giving men estrogen might be the saving bullet in combating the CCP virus. Not only was this used in more gynocentric propaganda by several thousands of men already at higher risk of dying because of the CCP virus were subjected to experimental treatments that would have never passed the basic safety approvals had the proposal been to give women testosterone. How do I know? Well, for starters, no testosterone treatment for women is approved by the FDA, not even as an emergency. And in fact, nobody ever dared to suggest that even though indeed higher levels of testosterone do strongly correlate with an even higher survival rate, even among men with serious comorbidities, still nobody suggested giving testosterone to women. Of course, experimenting with testosterone on older women already suffering from the Wuhan virus is unethical, and I'm not saying it should be done. But what I am saying is that these same actions, experimenting with cross-sex hormones on men already suffering from the Wuhan virus, was done without any ethical concern raised. And it was done with zero positive results and may have indeed led to the death of several men who would have otherwise survived. Of course, progress requires sacrifices, but those sacrifices are almost always male because they require courage, which is a masculine virtue. By the way, do you remember the "you're killing grandma" messaging meant to convince you to relinquish your personal autonomy and freedom of movement and subject yourself to sanitary fascism? Yeah, that was wrong as well, and it was intentionally wrong. By the time that kind of messaging emerged, everyone knew that when it comes to deaths from the CCP virus, men are twice as likely to die. But the powers that be relied, correctly I might add, on the inherent gynocentrism of the populace. Nobody in his or her right mind would relinquish basic civil rights in order to save the 60-year-old homeless man, Or even the 70-year-old uncle who might be too white, too Christian, and, heaven forbid, might have voted Republican, or Tory, or Alternative für Deutschland, or Prawo i Sprawiedliwość. You get the point. But for Grandma, well, that stood a chance to actually work. And, of course, it didn't work uniformly, but it was good enough. By the month of April, the feminist media complex, fully regimented into the general Chinese-inspired lockdownist propaganda, was doing NPC pieces like this one, titled "Why COVID-19 is Different for Men and Women." The article only mentions in passing that the death rate is twice as high for men than for women, which is much better than The Guardian's attempt at the same topic, which doesn't even mention this fact. And they all mention debunked nonsense about women's allegedly superior immunity. What was the BBC's main concern? Well, in a very Hillary Clinton way, they were concerned that while men may die twice as much from the CCP virus, the consequences on women may last longer. What consequences? Oh no! Urbanite women may actually have to spend some time with their children instead of dropping them to some soulless childcare institution, which may still be closed for a while as a result of feminine safetyist policies. Oh, and for the first time since forever, this recession has affected women by 0.2% more than it has affected men, and you say, that's a tragedy. It wasn't a tragedy in the previous 20 recessions, when men's unemployment numbers went way into double digits, whilst women's barely moved. And mind you, this may not even be entirely true even for the United Kingdom. Considering the amount of demonstrable outright falsehoods, in addition to gynocentric propaganda, churned out by the BBC during the pandemic hysteria, I will reserve my right to presume that the BBC may not be truthful even about the economic impact of the safetyist regime in the United Kingdom. And then came the measures. Almost all gynocentric. Remember the exemptions for alleged domestic violence victims? As almost anyone watching this is keenly aware, there are virtually zero domestic violence shelters for men in most of Europe. So, in practice, during the so-called stay-at-home orders, women quite literally had a get-out-of-jail-free card, since the actual enforcement of the measures lacked legal teeth. So any woman caught breaking the curfew or the stay-at-home orders could simply say she's heading towards a DV shelter, and many of them did. Now, admittedly, I myself advised a few to do this because I regard the COVID measures to be inherently illegitimate and morally reprehensible, so as a result I advised anyone who asked on how to avoid them, including, if necessary, by illegitimate means. The government locked me down under the lie that I'm killing grandma if I take a walk in the park. Like hell, I will lie right back to the government in order to continue my life as I please. And then there were the business shutdowns. Conveniently, in the professions with most women, the business shutdowns did not apply. Also, as a side note, conveniently, the Wuhan virus wasn't transmitted in Walmart or Carrefour, but it was transmitted in a small mom-and-pop store. But that's a discussion for another time and place. Also, remember the clap for heroes? Now, admittedly, this is a distinctly British example of corporatist-inspired public stupidity, but let us not forget that enough British people were convinced to clap for one of the most privileged classes of people in Europe, namely the NHS employees, mostly women and entirely immune from prosecution when they kill people. And they do, quite routinely. Now, admittedly, this also happened because generally the Brits have a ginormous cult for the NHS. Even though it's one of the least effective services of this kind, too many Brits still buy into the nonsense that the NHS is the envy of the world. Well, it is, in the sense that the NHS is the largest supplier of healthcare tourists for Eastern Europe. And let us not forget that the Brits were told to endure 3 rounds of intentional destruction of their socio-economic life in order to save the NHS, which in more realistic words means save the state and the women who work for it. You see, from the so-called heroes' point of view, the best policy is everyone stays in a sanitary gulag. That way they don't have to work that much and still get paid. And this is true for the vast majority of the hero doctors and nurses in the developed world. In the developing world, things are a bit better, paradoxically. For once, because the developing world has much more serious health issues to deal with, but also because in the developing world, the governments are more naked in their attempts to use this cough as a shortcut to increase their power, which translates into much fewer people adhering to the Church of COVID. And I call it the Church of COVID not only because this whole madness resembles an apocalyptic sectarian cult, but also because data over hundreds of years show that rigid religious following is, well, also a feminine virtue, which sometimes becomes a vice. Now, make no mistake, some masculine virtues were exploited to the point of becoming vices during this hysterical episode too. In some countries, such as Israel or France, appeals to the masculine virtue of honor was used into pressuring people to take the vaccine. And while I don't care whether anyone takes the CCP virus vaccine or not, it is worth noting that subverting a virtue to pressure people into agreeing with an experimental medical procedure is, well, a vice. And of course, the relatively neutral virtue of prudence was all but absent throughout the whole debacle. Almost nobody stopped to think about the side effects of safetyist policies. Well, aside from a few individuals who engaged in the masculine virtue of courage. The courage to tell the government and to the so-called experts that they're wrong, no matter how fancy their titles are and no matter how awe-inspiring their credentials may be. Incommensurable stupidity from Imperial College London is still incommensurable stupidity. Chapter 3. The slow and painful end of the hysteria. As with all episodes of mass hysteria, this one shall also end. Exactly how it will end is still an open question at the moment of this recording, but why it will end is very easy to explain. The main reason being that more people read and even more people become hungry, sometimes quite literally, which makes the case for this hysteria weaker by the day. It also doesn't help when so-called experts are consistently wrong by quite a huge margin. Remember when Neil Ferguson predicted in July 2021 that Brits will be coughing day in and day out as soon as the government no longer forces people to wear muzzles and generally intentionally destroy their socio-economic lives? Well, it's been 2 months and roughly speaking, the opposite happened. Again, because the relatively neutral virtue of prudence and of humility, I might add, was and continues to be absent, while the vice of hubris continues to run rampant. In addition to hunger and more people understanding the issue beyond what these so-called experts say, there is another more subtle but always present reason: how it affects women. We know from history that if something negatively affects women, that something will be changed or abolished, but rarely before that moment. Well, that moment is already here in some countries, and it's coming rapidly in the rest of the countries where this hysterical nonsense hasn't died on its own or of different causes. While this whole debacle affected men a lot more in terms of direct death from the virus, but also in indirect death as a result of suicide, delayed healthcare, undetected cancers, and so on and so forth, none of this mattered. It only starts to matter now as it becomes clear that this madness not only kills frail old men, but also youngish and middle-aged women who don't get cancer screenings and subsequent treatment in time. You see, twice the death rate for men wasn't a big deal, but a sudden uptick in death rate for youngish women who would have otherwise mostly survived if not for this hysterical nonsense, well, that is the problem. And then there's mental health. While it is safe to assume that mental health issues resulted from the hysterical and, yes, wrong and criminal response to the CCP virus likely cut roughly the same on both sexes, it is women who usually report them more. And that's because most of the mental health systems in place are gynocentric anyway. This will result in a public outcry about women being left behind, or some similar claptrap. And then there is, of course, young people in general. In any society, young people usually drive change. Now, of course, there are a few exceptions, but this one is not one of them. Young people have zero rational health concerns from the CCP virus. But you know what else young people have? Higher sex drives. And that is a primary energy. You don't want tens of hundreds of millions of frustrated incels out there who know exactly who is at fault for their situation. Trust me. Because you all know what else young people tend to do. Revolution. The death of this hysterical episode will be slow and painful, just like it was with previous episodes of mass hysteria. But when it will die, and it will, a lot of people will try hard, and most will succeed, to forget it ever happened. And those guilty of it will pretend, some of them successfully, albeit wrongly, that they were right all along. This is already starting to happen. Some of the most hysterical about how I was killing grandma are now stepping away slowly from the narrative while claiming to follow the science in order to avoid having to acknowledge that they fell for a moral panic. Many countries have seen this before. 35 years ago, it was the satanic rituals on children in countries like Brazil, the United States, Canada, Norway, Sweden, Italy, New Zealand, and others. That moral panic also got people killed, by the way. The satanic rituals panic was based on a kernel of truth, like any successful panic. Sexual abuse of children in daycare and schools does indeed happen, and oftentimes it does go unreported, but also induced responses in susceptible witnesses are a thing. This latter fact was, at the time, a conspiracy theory against settled science and, of course, an unempathetic position to the victims of a vast cabal of Satanists. Same thing is true today. Of course the CCP virus exists, and of course it kills people. It's just that effects have largely been exaggerated, sometimes intentionally so for ulterior motives, but oftentimes as a result of hubris and good old stupidity. Also, all moral panics have some lingering negative side effects on society. The satanic panic, for instance, has changed the way sexual crimes are investigated, in some ways for the better, but it also radicalized the public on the topic, a negative side effect that still lingers on. This will be true for this panic too, but that's outside the scope of this talk, and I have a sense that I'm approaching my time limit. Chapter 4. How to draw the lessons. Alright, so all of this was really a long introduction in order to explain how to learn and what to learn from this episode of mass hysteria. For starters, while this episode was not the biggest example of gynocentrism, the vastness of the episode throughout the developed world has tested some of the hypotheses and theories in the non-feminist space about human nature and the limits of politics in general and sexual politics in particular. This episode does confirm the existence of gynocentrism in real times in ways that many younger members of the non-feminist sector likely have never seen in their lifetimes. It also confirmed in very personal ways that male disposability is not just a YouTube talking point of the manosphere. But it also disproved certain assumptions. The mass hysteria over the Wuhan virus should have caught more on the elderly, the theory goes. After all, it's the elderly who indeed suffer from the virus itself, and it's usually boomers who push for safetyist nonsense, yet this wasn't really the case. More youngish people, let's say oldest millennials and youngest Gen Xers, fell for this hysteria, whilst the elderly and the very young remained largely immune. Even at the levels of heads of state we can see this correlation. Angela Merkel, Jair Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, Orban Viktor, and to a certain extent Boris Johnson, these are all boomers who did not go full insane. By comparison, younger ones, such as Emmanuel Macron of France, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, Sebastian Kurz of Austria, or Justin Trudeau of Canada, went full insane and hysterical, perfectly in line with the statistical norm of their age cohort. Why that happened is a complicated discussion, but for this talk, the fact that this happened is relevant, because it means that median age cohort of most of the developed world is susceptible to one certain kind of propaganda, agitprop, and activism. This fact is important for activism purposes. If you want to sell to this cohort a certain message, let's say non-feminism, the best way to do it is via panic card alarmism. Real or imaginary, it doesn't even matter. Previous episodes have confirmed this already. Austria and France have started curbing the influence of feminism when feminism was successfully tied to Islamism. Remember that what I'm advocating here is a tool, so it can be used for both good and evil. What I'm saying here basically is to look closely to the pandemic hysteria propaganda and priming and honestly and without bias evaluate its effects on different groups, be they by age, sex, economic condition, ethnicity, language, the whole nine yards. Such an analysis, which is way too complex to discuss in such a short video, will for sure provide insights on how to sell non-feminism to various groups. This will be a decent way forward. As we have all known since we embarked in this project more than a decade ago, we can't really hope to convince society as a whole, because society as a whole will always be gynocentric to a certain degree, making men's rights per se virtually impossible to sell on a mass scale. However, selling non-feminism in different ways to different groups is much more tenable, and we've been doing that quite successfully. Well, now the pandemic has just given us a gigantic data set of trial and error for messaging to various groups. Panicardism sells. Now all we have to do is to find a way to stoke those same emotions. If some people, the age group between 30 and 50 apparently, are willing to go against their basic reason and instincts and voluntarily destroy their socioeconomic lives because some expert on TV told them to be afraid of a cough that won't even seriously harm most of them, then surely those exact same people can be willing to go against their inculcated instinct to avoid upsetting women. Yes, I'm arguing for the very cynical approach of using the tools revealed in public for the gain of causes and messages that I like. While we're going to ask for much simpler things than what the COVID hysteria asked, we're also coming from a less advantageous position because we won't have the tools the government had to fuel the messaging. However, even with the current infrastructure, tailoring the messaging in such a way could still fasten progress. Keep in mind that in Europe, momentum is on our side. In France, the United Kingdom, some portions of the United States, and some portions of Brazil, not only public opinion, but also the state now actively backs a few distinctly non-feminist positions. This was, quite frankly, unimaginable in 2012 when I started writing for AVFM. We've come a long way, but with the current tools, we could do things even slightly faster if we're willing to put in the effort of analyzing and drawing the necessary conclusions of this latest mass hysteria episode and use those conclusions for the benefit of sanity. Keep in mind that we don't need 50% agreement in every society. In fact, in most of Europe, getting 10% agreement may be enough to impose the Prime Minister. We've done quite well, much better than I expected, to be honest with you, on the cultural front, but politics is downstream from culture, and while we're still far from winning most cultural disputes, we already won enough of them to be able to afford to start acting more vigorously in the political realm too. And the Wuhan flu hysteria has also revealed the viability of methods previously thought of as merely theoretical. It would be quite a shame if we don't use this new knowledge. And finally, chapter 5, hopefully I don't go over time, some conclusions. Now, as individual humans, as thinkers, as fathers, as spouses, professionals, content creators, and so on, we can, and indeed we should, have our own nuanced views about the pandemic. Feel free to disagree with everything I said about the Wuhan virus per se, or about the measures, it doesn't matter. The hysteria over the Wuhan virus is just the most recent and most visible example for the message that I want to bring. Namely that these episodes happen quite often and they reveal new things about the nature of propaganda, agitation, and forwarding of goals. So what does matter is that when we operate as activists, agitators, advocates, however you want to call it, we owe it to ourselves and to those we advocate for to be unscrupulous and not to hesitate using the knowledge revealed for everyone to see, but not for everyone to understand. The people who voluntarily signed up for the COVID hysterical sectarian cult will be very difficult to convince they've been wrong for many years to come. That's why you shouldn't even try. You don't debate with the devout, unless there's an audience, of course. But what if those same types of people can be gotten to the point of being equally vigorous on themes more of interest to us? I'm not saying we can turn covidopathic cultists into MRAs, but I am saying, given that what the pandemic hysteria has shown, some of these people's willingness to advocate things that are contrary to their own interests can be used for positive outcomes too. Their proclivities can be exploited, essentially. There is a gender disparity in deaths from COVID in hospitals. Well, that's because women are preferred, oftentimes explicitly, in hospitals after they're given, oftentimes explicitly by policy, an easier ride through the medical schools. What if we can save more women's lives by increasing male participation in the medical field? What if we can save grandma by having more male teachers? See what I did there? It's these kinds of things that I'm referring to. Yes, it's nasty, and yes, it's turning the tables on them, but then again, when I joined AVFM, fuck their shit up was the motto. So what I'm proposing now is indeed quite moderate. That's all I had to say. Thanks for watching my talk. Once again, thanks to J4MB and to Mike Buchanan for inviting me, and hopefully next year I get to drink a beer with y'all. Well, not really, I'm not drinking beer, but coffee. And especially I get to smoke a bajillion cigarettes with Karen and engage with many of y'all in discussions that we all know the public isn't ready for. That's it. Cheers.